Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto had multiple lovers and got harem with female Itachi, Shizune, Tsunade, May Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Naruto eyes widened at the sound of a baby crying. No, this wasn't any baby crying, this was his new baby brother. Naruto Namikaze, son of the 4th Hokage, was 4 years old. He was now the eldest son of Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki. He was relatively tall for his age. His hair, he also had the same shade of blonde as his father, however at the tip of the sides that hung down were red at the ends. His eyes were bright blue, also the same as his father, and now by the looks of things his brothers as well. He stood there unable to form words. He watched as Biawako take his brother to see his mother. Getting curious, Naruto walked over to his parents. He saw the smile on their faces and couldn't help but smile himself. Nimato, Kushina said as the young infant cried, "Say hello to Nimato, Naruto-chan." Kushina said. Naruto could only stare in amazement as Nimato's azure blue eyes opened and stared at him for what felt like hours. However, before Naruto could say anything, Biawako had come and collected Nimato and was getting ready to wash him. "Thank you, Kushina," Minato said to his wife as held her hand and tears forming around his eyes. Naruto smiled at the love between his parents. He watched patiently as his father prepared to fully seal the Kyuubi back into his mother. Apparently the seal weakened during pregnancy, so his father was needed to look after the seal. "Arg!" a voice shouted from behind them. Minato and Naruto quickly span around. Their eyes widened when they saw Biawako on the floor with 2 other nurses obviously dead. However, that's not what Naruto was worrying about, as right now he was glaring at a masked man who was holding his brother. "4th Hokage, step away from the Jinchuriki," the masked man said, pulling out a kunai from his sleeve and pointing it at Nimato. "Alright, just calm down," Minato said, narrowing his eyes at the man as the man held his newborn son hostage. "Speak for yourself, I'm perfectly calm," the masked man said, chucking Nimato in the air and prepared to stab him. However, Minato, using his superior speed, caught Nimato before the masked man could land his attack. "You live up to your Yellow Flash moniker, but what now?" the masked man asked. Minato's eyes widened at the explosive seals around the blanket of Nimato. Thinking quickly, Minato disappeared in a yellow flash. "Minato! Nimato!" Kushina shouted. Naruto quickly jumped in front of his mother. He may not know a whole lot of shinobi skills, he had been taught the basics by his parents. The masked man looked amused for a second while looking at Naruto. "You plan to stop me?" he asked, laughing slightly before dashing forward attempting to grab Naruto. However, just as the masked man was about to grab Naruto, wooden branches formed out of the ground and flew towards the masked man, but to Naruto's surprise they phased through him and smashed into the wall behind. "Mukten," the masked asked to himself slightly, "it seems I won't kill you after all. You may be some use to me in the future." And with that said, the man dashed and phased through Naruto and chopped him in the back of the neck. The last thing Naruto heard before succumbing to darkness was his mother shouting his name. Naruto slowly opened his eyes, however he was surprised when he found himself outside. He could feel the cold hitting his elbows since he was only wearing black t-shirt and 3/4 blue shorts. Picking himself up, Naruto shook his head. He still felt slightly dizzy after being hit. At the sudden thought, Naruto's eyes widened as he looked around and his memories came back to him. Out of the corner of his eye he caught something on his hand. He sighed when he saw his father flying Thunder God marker. "Dad must have rescued me, but why am I here?" Naruto thought. However, the sudden sound of a roar made him turn his head around. "No," Naruto thought, looking at the scene in front of him as his mother and father had been impaled by the Kyuubi's claw. Quickly getting back to his senses, he took off towards them. He idly noticed the chain-like barrier around them. "Tou-san, Ka-chan," Naruto shouted, stopping when he saw them both turn to him and smile. "Take care of Nimato-chan, Naruto-chan," Kushina said while Minato nodded. "Seal," Minato muttered, and suddenly all Naruto could see a bright light, and as fast as it had come it disappeared just as fast. Naruto shook slightly at the sight of his parents' limp bodies. Tears fell, and despite this, Naruto turned to a crying baby and smiled while picking him up, still unable to stop the tears. I will protect you, Naruto said while Minato giggled and tried to grab Naruto's finger. Naruto-kun, the voice of Hiruzen Sarutobi said. He approached them in his battle gear with two other Anbus. Yes, Hokage-sama, Naruto said, not even looking towards the old man. We need to get you and your brother away from here, Hiruzen said, bending down and helping Naruto up while the young blonde still kept hold of Minato. Naruto stopped a second and took a glance of his parents' dead bodies before looking towards Hiruzen. What about my parents? Naruto asked. Let us deal with them, Naruto-kun. Let's get you and your brother to my office. We can talk about what's next, Hiruzen said tiredly. Naruto nodded and walked back with Hiruzen. Hiruzen stared at the young boy in front of him and sighed. Naruto had been through a lot. He had witnessed war and now the death of his parents, but right now there was something worse he had to tell the young boy. How are you feeling, Naruto-kun? Hiruzen asked the young boy. Quote, quote. Naruto remained silent as he stared at his baby brother, the last piece of his family. Sensei, a voice from the window spoke. Hiruzen looked towards the window and smiled bitterly. Jiraiya, I'm glad you came. I know how you must be feeling right now, but there are important matters we must discuss, Hiruzen said tiredly as Jiraiya looked towards Naruto and the baby before sitting in a chair next to Naruto. Jiraiya, as you must have heard, the Kyuubi escaped from Kushina and attacked the village. Both Minato and Kushina didn't make it. Hiruzen stopped as he looked at the downcast look on both Naruto and Jiraiya's face. Before Minato died, he sealed half of the Kyuubi's power into his newborn son Minato. Jiraiya smiled sadly as he looked at the baby. However, we have a problem, Jiraiya. No doubt that the other villages will have heard of this, and with our weakened force we will be destroyed. Iwagakure will definitely start a war with us, hoping to destroy the remaining Namikaze family. Hiruzen looked towards Naruto, who looked shocked. We could probably hide Minato, but Naruto, the only thing stopping them from attacking before was Minato, and I'm not CE, Hiruzen said before Naruto stood up and looked towards Jiraiya. Jiraiya of the Sannin? Naruto asked. Jiraiya nodded. So you are the same Jiraiya who is both mine and Nimato's godfather? Jiraiya nodded once again. Could you hold Minato, please? Naruto asked quickly, handing over the young baby towards Jiraiya, who picked up the baby. Naruto smiled, before turning towards Hiruzen and shocked both Hiruzen and Jiraiya by falling to his knees and placing his head down to the floor, his nose grazing the wooden floorboards. Hokage-sama, please protect Minato. I'll do anything. I'll leave the village if I have to. Just please, protect him, please, Naruto begged, sobbing a little at the end. Naruto-kun, Hiruzen said slightly as he looked towards his student, who wore a shocked expression. Please, Naruto said. Hiruzen stood up from his chair and walked around his table towards Naruto and crouched down, placing a hand on his shoulder. Naruto-kun, you do understand what you're asking for, don't you? You would be declared officially dead, and until Minato is strong enough to protect himself, you would have to stay away from the village and your brother. Yes, just please keep him safe, Naruto pleaded once more. Hiruzen sighed, despite his human instincts telling him to refuse such a request of allowing Naruto to leave the village. His leadership instincts were also kicking in and knew this was the best idea. If word had gotten out that the Namikaze family had been killed, it would satisfy Iwagakure and would stop them attacking. Alright, Naruto-kun, I understand. I really wish this didn't have to happen, but I promise you I will protect Minato-kun, Hiruzen said. Jiraiya looked up in shock and betrayal. His sensei was actually going to let his godchild alone in the world outside the village. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Naruto said, crying. However, Naruto-kun, you will not be going alone. My student here will be taking you with him until you can take care of yourself. I'm sorry, Naruto-kun, but you will have to grow up fast, Hiruzen said solemnly. I understand, Hokage-sama, but about my brother? Naruto asked. Your brother will go by the name Minato Uzumaki. Officially only 4 people will know of his relation to you and your parents: myself, Jiraiya, you and my Anbu captain Hatake Kakashi, Hiruzen stopped looking towards Naruto and turned to Jiraiya. Jiraiya, I need you to go to Minato's house and collect the notes of Hiraishin no Jutsu and some clothing that will hide Naruto-kun's appearance. Jiraiya nodded, handing the baby back to Naruto and disappearing. It seems I'm not going to be able to watch you grow up, Minato, Naruto said with a sigh as the baby cooed. Hiruzen sighed sadly at the sight of a once full family now torn apart. Naruto sighed as he prepared everything ready for him to leave the village. He did feel content that the Hokage would protect Minato while he was gone, however these were not the only thoughts going through Naruto's head right now. I must find out who that man was. He will pay for what he has done. I don't think telling Hokage-sama or Jiraiya-sama would be wise. They would think I'm making it up. Also, I need to find out what that guy meant when he said Mukten, Naruto thought before he felt a hand on his shoulder. You ready, Gaki? Jiraiya said, looking at Naruto, who now wore a black Anbu clothing and brown cloak with the hood up. Yes, Jiraiya-sama, Naruto said respectfully before Jiraiya lightly punched him on the head. None of that formal stuff with me, Gaki. How about Jiraiya-sensei? Jiraiya said enthusiastically. Naruto gave a small smile and nodded. Alright, take one last look around. You won't be seeing this place for a while. Naruto took one last look. Most of Konoha was still lying in rubble thanks to the Kyuubi, but this was his home. He had walked the streets with his parents. I'm ready, Jiraiya-sensei, Naruto said. Both now student and master began to make their departure from Konoha. As Naruto and Jiraiya were about to make it towards the gate, Naruto's eyes caught sight of a girl who looked to be around the same age as himself. She had black hair that reached her middle back, black eyes, and she was wearing a blue top with black bottoms. He idly noticed the Uchiha symbol on her back. However, the sight that killed him was that she was holding a baby that didn't look much older than Minato. Noticing his stare, the young girl caught his gaze. Naruto was thankful he had his hood up. Quickly turning his head, Naruto and Jiraiya left with the peace of mind that Minato would be safe under Hiruzen. As Naruto took his first step out of the village, he looked up at the night sky and smiled a little. At least some people will stay and look after their siblings, Naruto thought, his mind drifting back to the girl he saw, unaware of how wrong his thoughts were. Naruto continued walking. Naruto sighed as he and Jiraiya reached the edge of the land of fire. It had been a few weeks since they had left the village, and Naruto was reflecting on what he was told to do by his new sensei. Flashback. Naruto and Jiraiya had been walking away from Konoha for a couple of hours. However, Jiraiya stopped, and following his example, so did Naruto. Gaki, I hate to say this, but we've got to get you strong and fast. So growing up fast is an essential. I know your Minato and Kushina were beginning to train you, but they were doing it at your pace, but now you'll have to learn fast, Jiraiya said seriously. I know, Jiraiya-sensei, I'm ready to grow up, Naruto said just as seriously. Really? Are you? Do you not want to cry over the deaths of your parents, the fact that you won't be able to see your brother until you're strong enough? Jiraiya spat out. Aye. Naruto started. He had surpassed all the thoughts of his parents into the back of his mind due to the situation of protecting his brother, but now as time seemed to catch up to him, memories flooded his system. Times when he would wake up and see his parents smiling, his mother already preparing his breakfast, his father smiling and telling him all sorts of stories. And like that, Naruto dropped to his knees and sobbed for the loss of his parents and the loss of his happy life. Jiraiya smiled a little. The kid had finally released what he was feeling instead of bottling it all up. Crouching down, Jiraiya pulled Naruto into a hug and let the boy just cry. After 20 minutes of crying, Naruto stepped back and smiled sadly. So much for growing up, huh? Naruto said. Everyone cries despite their age. There is nothing shameful about that, Jiraiya explained, patting Naruto on the back. End of flashback. Gaki, you ready? Jiraiya asked, slipping into a fighting stance. Naruto nodded, getting into his own. Jiraiya had started training Naruto's taijutsu the day after they had left Konoha and being trained by his parents a little. Naruto was a little better than Jiraiya had expected, but nonetheless utterly destroyed him. Naruto ran at Jiraiya and jumped so he could perform a roundhouse kick. However, expecting it, Jiraiya blocked it with the back of his hand and used his other to grab his foot. Seeing the danger, Naruto used his other foot to try kick Jiraiya in the face. However, Jiraiya's speed was way faster than Naruto's and he ended up being thrown across the plane they were training in. Naruto picked himself up, walked towards Jiraiya and circled him looking for any openings he could find. He frowned however when Jiraiya straightened up and folded his arms. He's not taking me seriously, Naruto thought before running towards Jiraiya, and as he saw Jiraiya about to swipe his hand to grab him, Naruto started to slide and ducked underneath it. Thinking fast, he spring-boarded himself up and kicked Jiraiya in the stomach. Too slow, sensei, Naruto said smugly, however fell back when he saw Jiraiya explode in a cloud of smoke. Up in a tree looking down at the fight, Jiraiya smiled. His Kage Bunshin had been beaten. He could see that Naruto was a lot like Minato all the way through the fight. The way he stopped to take a breather, how he circled his opponent to find an opening, and how he remembered patterns in fights. It seemed the things he inherited of Kushina was the stamina, chakra levels, and his red tips and the end of his blonde bangs. However, he was curious about his healing factor after his Kage Bunshin through Naruto. The toss, despite being weak, still should have caused some damage to Naruto, but they seemed to disappear. Jiraiya didn't find it that strange since some ninjas had always healed faster than most. The Shodaime Hokage Hashirama Senju was known to be able to heal himself without any medical treatment from others. Kushina had also seemed to heal fast, but that was thanks to the Kyuubi, wasn't it? However, looking at Naruto, he couldn't decide what it was. It was either he had gained healing abilities while being in his mother's womb, or he had the same ability of the first. Also, he had found out Naruto was a genius. The boy would analyze everything he was given. At times he thought he was talking to a younger Minato, but even Minato's growth rate wasn't this good. Naruto was picking things up faster than anyone he had ever seen, even Orochimaru. Naruto, Jiraiya said, dropping out of the tree and walking over to the boy. Huh? What was that jutsu you just used, Jiraiya-sensei? Naruto asked. That was Kage Bunshin, and unlike the normal Bunshin, they are physical, however they are extremely weak. They can also be used for another purpose. Sit down here, Naruto, Jiraiya said, sitting down closely followed by Naruto. In fact, I'm glad you're interested in this jutsu. It will save us a lot of time. There is also another special side effect with this jutsu. When the clone dispels all the knowledge the clone gained, it returns back to the original, Jiraiya explained. Naruto nodded, extremely fascinated. If this technique is so useful, how come there aren't many people who use this method? Naruto asked. The technique is extremely dangerous as well, since each clone created is created with evenly distributed chakra levels, and if overused it could kill the user, Jiraiya said, shocking Naruto. However, you are quite fortunate because thanks to your Uzumaki background you were born with higher than normal chakra levels, Naruto nodded happily at Jiraiya. Well, that's all for now. I'm going to leave this scroll with you while I go do some research, Jiraiya smiled perversely. You're just going to spy on women in the hot springs, aren't you, Jiraiya-sensei? Naruto sighed at his perverted teacher's antics as the man just smiled and vanished. There's no point wasting any more time. I wonder how you are holding up, Minato, Naruto said as he went back to his training. Jiraiya sighed as he walked back towards where Naruto was. He had seen one of his many contacts regarding Iwa's movements. There had been a mass of cheers from Iwagakure at the news of the death of the Namakazes. Jiraiya had found out that they were going to leave Konoha alone to lick their wounds at the loss of the Yondaime's family. Of course, he had found all this out after his research at the local hot springs. Walking into the clearing, Jiraiya smiled when he saw Naruto passed out lying underneath a tree. He could already tell the Naruto was going to be powerful, perhaps even the child of prophecy. Jiraiya gave up that thought, however, as he remembered thinking the exact same thing about the boy's father. Silently sitting down next to a tree, Jiraiya started a fire and stared up at the sky. The stars were shining. Pulling out a brush and some ink, Jiraiya got back to his writing. Naruto huffed as he finished his training for the day. It had been 3 years since Naruto had learnt the Kage Bunshin. He had put the jutsu to use. Thanks to his higher chakra levels, he had been able to create 300 clones of himself. While he had learnt that the jutsu doesn't increase actual physical strength, it did improve strategies and jutsus. Naruto put down the giant rock he was carrying vertically up a mountain and wiped off the sweat. Naruto had grown to an impressive 4'9". He had started to develop a figure with muscles showing through. His hair had not grown any longer in length, but the red tips had darkened. He walked over towards a tree that had all his equipment rested on and sat laid down next to it while releasing a bottle of water from a scroll he had and downed it almost immediately. After the first year, Naruto had showed an interest in sealing when the subject of his brother's seal came up. Naturally, being an Uzumaki, Naruto had adapted to it like a fish in water. He had started with simple weapon and storage seals and has got to the point where he could seal elements into a scroll. Another skill Naruto had picked up upon was Kenjutsu. He had used his Kage Bunshin to learn skills and techniques faster than he could ever imagine. He had even come to the conclusion since his brother was a Jinchuriki he would have the ability to create thousands of Kage Bunshins. Jiraiya had also tested Naruto's elemental natures. He had found he had an extremely strong Suiton, Doden, Futon and Raiden. However, he had been able to master Suiton, Raiden, Doden and Futon. Propping himself onto his elbows, Naruto smiled as he saw his clones dispel. He did, however, find the knowledge he received a bit of a pain, but he was happy nonetheless that he would be stronger and more able to protect Minato. Naruto! Jiraiya shouted, getting the young blonde's attention. Naruto smiled at the sight of his sensei and godfather. He did feel guilty though, as he felt he was taking all of Jiraiya's time for himself while Minato never got any attention. However, the thought of the Hokage looking after him shook him of such thoughts. Jiraiya-sensei, you're back, are you staying? Naruto asked. Jiraiya had been going on trips and leaving Naruto for longer and longer each time. Of course, Jiraiya had taught him the basics like catching his own food, the right and wrong people to talk to. Also, he had taught him the 3 vices of being a shinobi. "Aw, sorry kid, I just came to check on how you're progressing with the Rasengan. I have to go meet some contacts in Kumogakure," Jiraiya explained. Naruto smiled softly at his sensei's devotion for his village. "Oh, alright, look," Naruto said, holding out his palm, and immediately a blue sphere-shaped ball appeared. "That's amazing, you were able to complete that jutsu in 3 weeks, so how's the Hiraishin no jutsu coming along?" Jiraiya asked. Naruto frowned. Despite being good at seals, Naruto was stumped at his father's ultimate technique. "I've made little progress with it other than I know I need a new seal pattern, as the original was designed personally for my father, and I'm still not certain on how to include my own seal design and use it for traveling. All I know is that the time and space ninjutsu part of it is the most complicated thing I've ever seen," Naruto said. Jiraiya was surprised at Naruto's knowledge of the technique. "Well, you're making a lot more progress than I ever did. I'm sure you'll pick it up eventually. Anyway, I also came here for another reason. As you know, Sensei told me that I'd be training you until you were able to look after yourself. For the last 3 years I've been minimizing by work for the village in the spy department. Well, I guess I'm here to say that I won't be looking on you so often, maybe once every 3 months, Jiraiya said awkwardly. Naruto looked at Jiraiya a little saddened. He knew he didn't need Jiraiya for training anymore, but he was still the only person he could talk to about his family. "I understand, Jiraiya-sensei," Naruto said. "Looks like this is where we go separate ways, for a while. Stay safe and don't get yourself killed," Jiraiya said, grinning before giving Naruto's hair a ruffling. "See you later, kid, and don't be afraid to woo women," Jiraiya grinned and immediately vanished. Naruto sighed and strapped his katana to his back and reapplied his cloak on and started walking away. "Looks like I'm on my own," Naruto said. "Get out of here, monster," yelled a shopkeeper as he pushed a young blonde boy over onto the floor. Immediately groups of people crowded the area and stared at the boy with hatred. "Is this what you wanted? Here, have it, just don't ever come back," the same shopkeeper yelled, throwing a fox mask at the boy. The young blonde-haired boy with blue eyes stood up and looked across the crowd and noticed the stares of hatred he was receiving. "Just what are you staring at?" he shouted, pushing his way past the crowd while tears fell from his eyes as he clutched onto his fox mask as hard as he could. Why was everyone so angry at him? Sure, he did some pranks, but it was more than that. People he had never even met before glared at him. First, his teacher glared at him and paid no attention at all to his presence and even encouraged the other children in the academy to make fun of him. Running into his apartment, the young boy sat on his bed and pulled his knees up to his chest while wrapping his arms around them, as the moon lit up his room. Nimato Uzumaki, the Jinchuriki of the Kyubi, sat on his bed and cried over his treatment from the villagers. The young boy had blonde spiky hair, clear blue eyes, and 3 whisker marks on each cheek. He wore a black top and orange shorts. The only people who were ever nice to him were Ichiraku, his daughter Ayame, Hokage Gigi, and surprisingly a weasel-masked Anbu. He could tell she was a girl, and sometimes she would have asked him if he was alright, or when they would do his shopping she would have made sure he would have enough food, while most of the other Anbus got him the bare minimum. However, he had not seen that Anbu for a while. She had disappeared shortly after the Uchiha clan was massacred. Another thing Nimato had always found strange was how he had always had enough money to buy what he wanted despite being overpriced for pretty much everything. However, he just assumed that Hokage Gigi gave it to him. Looking out of his window, Nimato could see mothers and fathers walking with their children while smiling. Quickly sighing, Nimato let more tears come out. "Someone, please help me." Naruto's eyes snapped open and he sat up in the bed he was in. Quickly standing up, Naruto yawned as he stood at an impressive 5'6". He was now 13 years old and had grown. He was muscular and showed no baby fat. His face was more defined, losing its childish features. His eyes had narrowed, and sometimes he had thought he was staring at a reflection of his father when he looked into the mirror. Quickly getting dressed, Naruto put on his usual black Anbu top and bottoms and his fingerless gloves that had protective metal on the back. He also quickly wrapped up his arms so the seals he had placed on them were covered. Naruto sighed as he heard the sound of a woman's breathing in the bed he was just in. She was a random woman he had been speaking to at a bar. As soon as she had saw him, she had started flirting with Naruto straight away, and judging by the man next to her, he could only imagine that was her husband. Rolling over slightly, the woman put her hand on where Naruto's pillow was. Yep, definitely the man's wife, if the ring on her finger said anything. He did feel slightly guilty now, but after looking for missing nin and collecting their bounty, Naruto had always found himself looking for a way to release all the stress he had in his body. Sometimes he would just drink until he passed out in one of the inn's rooms, and sometimes he would just have with a woman he found attractive. He did blame Jiraiya for the way he acted, since on his 13th birthday Jiraiya has surprised him by taking him to a brothel and told him that the life of a shinobi is too short and he should enjoy the pleasures of life. So with that, Jiraiya had handed over a lot of money to a hooker he had found in the brothel, and she had dragged Naruto into the room, and despite feeling a little dirty afterwards, Naruto did actually enjoy himself, and it did release a lot of stress he had built up from traveling alone. From murderers to rapists, Naruto had searched them down through different countries and had destroyed them single-handedly, and some of the scenes he had come across had scarred him. "What time is it?" the woman from the bed asked, sitting up, letting her exposed bounce. Naruto turned his head towards the woman and grunted in annoyance as he strapped his katana to his back. Taking in her appearance, Naruto had summarized that he could have done worse. The woman had blonde hair, long eyelashes, and bright green eyes. She was fairly large in the compartment, but he had seen bigger. "I don't know, it's still pretty early though, you should get some more sleep," Naruto said while placing his black sandals on. "Well, come back to bed then," the woman said. Naruto stood up and turned to the women. "No, I'm leaving, thank you for last night," Naruto explained while walking to the door. "Wait. You're leaving? What about those things you said last night about how you could show me the world?" the woman replied, upset as she stood up, allowing Naruto to look everywhere. "I'm scum." Naruto sighed and turned around. "Listen, I'm sorry. Perhaps you should go find your husband and see if he'll take you back," Naruto said, opening the door. "So, what? I was just some easy fuck to you," the woman shouted, finally covering herself up while she started to cry. Naruto stood at the doorway for a couple of seconds before answering. "Yes." And with that, Naruto walked out and not once turned around to look at the woman fall to her knees and sob. "Now I remember why I don't do this often." Stepping out of the inn, Naruto looked into the sky. It was still early and Naruto had heard reports that the missing nin he had been searching for the whole week was somewhere around these areas. Just as he was about to leave the place, he bumped into the man he had saw last night with the women. "Hey kid, have you seen my wife?" the man asked. He was a fairly average-sized man, black short hair. "I think I saw her in room 213. She seemed a little upset," Naruto said, not sure what else to say. "Oh, okay, thanks kid," the man said, walking back into the inn and making his way up to the room. "Don't thank me," Naruto mumbled, disappearing in a yellow flash. Appearing in the middle of a field, Naruto quickly took a look at his surroundings and quickly noticed Jiraiya. It was surprising, really. This was the second time he had actually seen Jiraiya this year. "Jiraiya-sensei." Naruto greeted his sensei as the man looked up at Naruto and smiled. "Naruto, I'm glad you came. We have a mission in the Land of Lightning," Jiraiya explained, standing up. Naruto frowned. He had already set himself on a mission that he was close to completing. "Jiraiya-sensei, can't you do this one by yourself? I'm kind of in the middle of my own mission," Naruto explained. "Then drop it. Trust me, I will need your help. It's Orochimaru," Jiraiya said dangerously at the name. Naruto sighed. How could he say no? Jiraiya had taught him how to survive, and also Orochimaru was a threat to Minato. "Okay. Let's go," Naruto said sadly. "Hey, cheer up kid, you'll be turning 14 in a couple of days," Jiraiya said, putting his arm around Naruto's shoulder and smiling. Naruto looked thoughtful for a second. He had actually lost count of the date. If he was turning 14, Minato would be 9 now and would be soon be 10. "I guess you're right, come on, let's go," Naruto said, hopping into the trees, closely followed by Jiraiya. A few hours later, Naruto stopped on the tree he was jumping and looked at Jiraiya, who was several feet ahead of him. "Why are you stopping, Naruto?" Jiraiya asked, also stopping. "What's the rush, Jiraiya-sensei?" Naruto asked as he narrowed his eyes slightly. "What do you mean?" Jiraiya asked. "You are barely ever this serious with a mission. What's different about this one?" Naruto asked. Jiraiya sighed a little before walking towards Naruto. "Tsunade, my old teammate, is also in Kumogakure. She could be in danger," Jiraiya said quietly while Naruto raised his eyebrows. "You love her then?" Naruto stated while Jiraiya simply nodded. "Why haven't you told her then?" Naruto asked, curious as to why his sensei had not been together with the women he loves. Jiraiya put his head down a little. "I have, but she's always rejected me," Jiraiya said sadly. Naruto could feel sympathy for the man. "Oh, well, let's go. We don't want to be late, do we?" Naruto said. Jiraiya nodded and both student and master continued running through the trees. Land of Lightning. Naruto, we'll stop at the next town ahead. I've had reports Tsunade has been staying there, Jiraiya stated, looking towards his student. Naruto nodded in confirmation. It wasn't long before both Jiraiya and Naruto found an opening that led to the town, hastily slowing their pace to a walk as both Naruto and Jiraiya walked into town. "So where is the best place to look be?" Naruto asked under his hood without breaking his stride. "Bars and gambling dens most likely. Here's a picture of her," Jiraiya said while fishing into his pockets and pulled out a small photo of Tsunade. Naruto was a little stunned at the picture in front of him as he took it. The women had hazel eyes, milky skin, full lips, and the most beautiful face he had ever seen. "This is Tsunade. Wouldn't she be a little older than here?" Naruto asked. Jiraiya chuckled slightly at Naruto. "Don't be fooled, she is my age. She's just hiding it under a henge," Jiraiya explained. "Still, she's beautiful," Naruto whispered. "Yeah, she is," Jiraiya stated as they stopped at a bar. Walking into the bar, Naruto frowned at the heavy smell of smoke and alcohol. It seemed that every bar was the same. Quickly scanning the area, Naruto didn't see Tsunade anywhere. Just as he was about to tell Jiraiya, he stopped as he heard something interesting. "So she took the deal. You really suckered her there," one man said. Naruto gave Jiraiya a look and Jiraiya nodded back. "Yeah, she actually fell for it," another said while laughing and pouring himself some sake. Silently, Naruto took a seat opposite the man and his friends, while Jiraiya watched intrigued on what his godson had planned. "What do you want, kid?" the man asked in annoyance while staring at Naruto. Naruto giving the most emotionless look he could give and took the photo he had of Tsunade and placed it in the center of the table they were all sitting at. This woman, have you seen her? Naruto asked. The man laughed slightly, causing Naruto to narrow his eyes. Maybe, maybe not. Why do you want to know? The man asked. Personal reasons, Naruto said flatly. He knew what the man was trying to do, but he refused to be forced to strike a deal. Maybe a little cash would loosen my lips, the man said smugly, showing his horrible yellow teeth. Naruto sighed and in a blink of an eye was crouched on the table and had his blade pressed against the man's neck. I'm not here to play games with you. In fact, just being in your presence is making my skin crawl, so if you want to keep your head on your shoulders, I suggest you tell me where she is, Naruto said dangerously. The man panicked and started to sweat when he felt a little trickle of his blood slide down his neck and looked around the bar to see his friends widen their eyes and the bar get extremely quiet. Please, don't kill me, the man said in fear. Then tell me what I want to know, Naruto whispered. She was at the gambling den 2 miles southwest from here. She'll probably be still there, the man said, shaking when he felt Naruto press his blade a little harder. You better be telling the truth or I'll be back, Naruto said, hopping off the table and walking out of the bar, closely followed by Jiraiya. So intimidation rather than bargaining, Jiraiya said when they were out of the bar. I don't bargain with trash like that, Naruto said emotionlessly as they continued to walk towards the den. Naruto did notice that the sun had gone down and tomorrow he would be 14 years old. Looking around, Naruto did notice many bars and even a hot springs. Perhaps spending his birthday in this town wasn't that much of a bad idea. We're here, Jiraiya said, looking towards a single wooden door. How can you tell? Naruto asked. I've seen enough gambling dens in my life to know where one is, Jiraiya said, opening the door, but before he could open it he was sent flying back to the other side of the street. Fine, I'm leaving. I'd eventually pay you back. You don't have to be so stingy, a woman said, walking out. Naruto's eye widened when he saw her, as there was Tsunade Senju. She was wearing a green haori and a white robe top with brown bottoms. Tsunade Senju, Naruto said, and immediately Tsunade looked towards Naruto and raised her eyebrows when she saw the hooded man. Who are you and what do you want? Tsunade asked. Naruto sighed. This was going to be a long night. Naruto sighed as he looked at the woman in front of him. She was a light-skinned woman with hazel eyes and straight blonde hair. Her hair went down to her waist in 2 ponytails and formed 2 bangs that framed her face. She had a diamond-shaped mark on her forehead which Naruto immediately recognized. She was wearing a grass-green haori with the words Gamble written on the back. Underneath that she wore a kimono-style blouse with no sleeves and was held closed by broad, dark bluish-gray obi that matches her pants. Her blouse was held quite low, giving Naruto a good view of her cleavage. She also wore open-toed sandals with high heels and red polish on her toenails. However, what Naruto noticed straight away was the green necklace around her neck. Tsunade Senju? Naruto asked. He watched as the woman's eyes narrowed at him. Maybe who wants to know? She demanded, and as Naruto was about to answer he felt an arm wrap itself around his shoulder. Looking back he could see his godfather and sensei smiling. Haim, why such a negative greeting? Jiraiya said while leaning on Naruto, surprisingly only showing a small nosebleed despite how brutal the hit looked. Jiraiya, what are you doing here? Tsunade asked, signaling her hand for someone to walk out from a hiding spot. Oh, you know me, just checking up on a few things, Jiraiya answered. Naruto vaguely wondered why he didn't tell Tsunade that it was an Orochimaru-related problem but shrugged it off, thinking he was being a little overprotective. Well, whatever, let's just go to a bar. I've lost enough money today, Tsunade muttered sourly while Naruto watched as another woman came running out of the door behind Tsunade. The woman was a fair-skinned woman of average height and had black hair and black eyes. Her hair was straight and shoulder length with bangs that cover her eyes and frame her face. She wore a bluish-black kimono with white trimmings, held closed by a white obi. She also wore open-toed sandals with low heels, and in her hands was a small pig. Ah, Shizune-chan, it's so good to see you. It also looks like you've grown more womanly since I last saw you, Jiraiya said perversely while looking at the black-haired woman's curves and bosom. Cram it, pervert, before I punch you, Tsunade said dangerously, obviously protective of the other woman. Fine, let's go get a drink and catch up, Jiraiya said, walking back towards the center of town, closely followed by Naruto, Tsunade and Shizune. Several minutes later, the group sat round a table sipping on sake. So what's the deal with the brat, Jiraiya? Tsunade asked, gulping down a cup of sake as if it was water. Naruto frowned a little when he heard the way Tsunade talked about him as if he wasn't even in the room. Well, it's kind of a long story, Jiraiya said, rubbing the back of his head, and then began to explain everything. So you're Minato and Kushina's kid, huh? I thought you had died the same night as your parents, but I can see why you left, she said, pouring another cup of sake and leaning back, letting her cleavage bounce a little as she had now discarded her haori. Naruto grunted slightly before pouring himself a cup of sake and downing it just as fast as Tsunade, getting raised eyebrows from said woman and Shizune, while Jiraiya sighed, knowing that Naruto was able to drink a lot more sake than that. So how long are you two planning on staying here? Jiraiya asked. Don't know, most likely a couple of more days, Tsunade answered, narrowing her eyes at her old teammate. Good. Could you stay here and look after Naruto for a couple of days? He turns 14 in 2 days. I'm sure you will help the kid have a great birthday, Jiraiya said while smiling. Naruto, on the other hand, felt like choking his sensei. The man was treating him like some kid that couldn't even wipe his nose without any help. Pay me, Tsunade said simply while both Jiraiya and Naruto cocked an eyebrow up. What? Jiraiya said, confused. Pay me and I'll look after the brat for a couple of days while you go do whatever you want, Tsunade answered in boredom. Okay, Jiraiya answered flatly, disappointed at Tsunade, and placing a large bag on the table. As Naruto was about to protest that he didn't need babysitting, Jiraiya motioned Naruto to follow him. What the hell, I don't need looking after sensei, Naruto said while keeping his voice down. No, I'm not doing it for you, Jiraiya answered seriously, leaving Naruto confused. If Orochimaru is around these areas and finds out Tsunade is here, he might try to dispose of her or try get her to work with him. The reason I brought you here is to make sure she doesn't get hurt or do something stupid, Jiraiya said quietly. Naruto was a little shocked at his sensei's loyalty. Fine, alright, I understand now. Be careful though when dealing with him, Naruto said. Hey, remember who you're talking to. I know Orochimaru better than anyone, Jiraiya said, waving towards the table that both Shizune and Tsunade were sat at, and laughed slightly when only Shizune waved back. Take care of yourself, kid, Jiraiya said, walking out of the bar, leaving Naruto standing there for a couple of seconds. Idiot, that's my line, Naruto said to himself before turning around and walking back to the table Tsunade and Shizune were sat at. Well, brat, looks like I'll be looking after you for a while, and my first rule is, no more sake, Tsunade laughed to herself before taking the bottle Naruto had and started drinking it. Must calm down, Naruto thought while his eyebrow twitched in annoyance. So Naruto-kun, how old will you be in 2 days? Shizune asked, breaking the mood, making Naruto smile slightly. 14, it's going to feel a little weird actually, Naruto muttered while scratching his head. Why? Shizune asked curiously. Even Tsunade had lowered the cup next to her mouth and gave Naruto a side glance, waiting for an answer. It just feels weird, to be honest. I've been out here for so long that I feel a lot older, Naruto answered. Yeah, well, the life of a shinobi will do that to you, Tsunade said in a sing-song voice. Well, what about you then, because you look a lot younger than you should be, Naruto smirked at the twitching of Tsunade's eyebrow. What was that? Tsunade asked, a dark evil aura suddenly surrounding her. Nothing, Naruto smirked, folding his hands behind his head, while Shizune looked on worried. Clever, brat, at least I can see the Kushina in you, Tsunade said before drinking down another cup, leaving both Naruto and Shizune to sigh as it seemed it was going to be a long night. In all his life, Naruto had never been so annoyed in his life. He had battled annoying missing nin, dealt with backstabbers, and even his perverted godfather. Even though they were all annoying to him, he was able to deal with it. However, right now he could feel the last of his patience wearing out. Why, you ask? Well, right now Naruto could be found walking down a deserted street next to Shizune and an extremely drunk woman who was leaning on Naruto because she was too drunk to walk by herself. No kid, you look a lot like Minato, Tsunade annoyingly slurred. Again Naruto's eye twitched. Was he this annoying when he was drunk? Certainly he was a little annoying, but this was taking the piss. Who does she think she's calling kid? Naruto thought to himself. Well, obviously I look like my father since it's genetics. I'd be worried if I never. Naruto mumbled, annoyed at the busty blonde. Oh well, aren't you smart? You have a little brother, don't you? Does he look like Minato as well? Tsunade asked. Naruto narrowed his eyes slightly at the question before giving a side glance to Tsunade. I don't know. Why are you asking me? Go find out yourself if you want to know, Naruto said as they approached a hotel. So, you haven't seen your brat? Tsunade started until Naruto pointed at the hotel. Is this it? Naruto asked, ignoring her answer and walking to the hotel. Will you be booking a room here as well, Naruto-kun? Shizune asked. Yeah, but firstly we have to get this drunk to bed, Naruto said, walking into the hotel and walking to the reception. One room please, Naruto said in a tired voice to the men behind a desk. Oh, aren't you a little too young to be with these women? The man asked. Naruto frowned and took a look at the man. He had dark skin, a white beard, and thick glasses. Naruto figured this guy was in his 60s at least. That's nothing for you to be concerned over, Naruto said, a little annoyed that the man was treating him like a child. Alright, here, don't do anything I wouldn't do, the man said with laughter in his voice. Naruto grumbled as he took a side glance towards Tsunade and Shizune, but was surprised when he saw them giving him surprised looks. What? He asked, annoyed at their state of shock. Naruto-kun, we were wondering why you weren't embarrassed by that man, Shizune asked, sporting a small blush. However, as Naruto was about to answer, he was shocked when Tsunade stopped leaning on him and punched her palm. That bastard turned you into a pervert, didn't he? Tsunade stated darkly before glaring at Naruto. What? No, I mean I do like the feel of a woman's body, but that's just. Naruto stopped and gulped when he saw the glare Tsunade was giving him. So you admit to being a pervert? Tsunade asked, all drunkenness gone. Yeah. I mean no, well, I'm not really over the top, but all guys are a little perverted, Naruto said, trying to hold his ground against the legendary Sannin. So you're not as innocent as I thought, huh? Minato and Kushina would kill Jiraiya if they didn't get themselves killed, Tsunade said, laughing to herself a little. However, Naruto frowned a little. Of course he knew they were dead, but did she have to keep saying it as if it was their own fault? Jiraiya will probably do the same with that brother of yours as well, Tsunade continued to herself. I'm off to my room, Naruto said, not wanting to talk Tsunade in her drunken state. Oh well, have a good sleep, Naruto-kun. I'm sorry for what Tsunade-sama said, Shizune called to Naruto as she watched him walk down the corridor. Tsunade-sama, I think you upset Naruto-kun with what you said, Shizune said to her master as Tsunade stood up straight as she no longer had Naruto to support on. Tsunade watched the retreating form of Naruto as he left and smiled slightly. Of course she was drunk, but she wasn't drunk to the point where she needed someone to lean on. Yeah, it would seem his brother is a sensitive subject, no surprise really, but he should realize that when it comes to the ones we love nothing's ever fair, Tsunade said as she walked to her room, leaving Shizune in the corridor. Naruto sighed as he dropped down onto his bed. He had placed his katana next to his bed, a habit he picked up on after he had been attacked by bandits when he was sleeping. The nerve of that woman, she's nothing like how Jiraiya-sensei described her to be, Naruto thought bitterly at the thought of the blonde-haired women. Naruto was brought out of his thoughts, however, when he heard the sound of someone knocking. Who is it? Naruto asked angrily, still angered at the words Tsunade said. It's me, Naruto-kun. Shizune, Naruto raised an eyebrow. He was certain the black-haired woman had followed Tsunade, so why was she knocking on his door? Picking himself up, Naruto made his way over to the door and opened it to reveal Shizune standing there nervously. Not to be rude or anything, but what are you doing here? Naruto asked. Well, I came here to apologize for Tsunade-sama, Shizune answered nervously while Naruto narrowed his eyes. You can save it, you shouldn't apologize for others, Naruto said, closing the door. However, before door closed, Shizune put her hand on it, stopping it. I also came here to tell you why Tsunade-sama is like how she is. Please listen, Shizune said desperately. Naruto raised an eyebrow at her, pleading. It was more like she needed someone to actually talk to than rather explain why her master was so cold-hearted. Sighing again, Naruto opened the door fully. Come on in, Naruto said plainly, letting the black-haired woman in. However, as she walked past, he couldn't help but notice the shape of her body as she walked. How her C-cup would bounce ever so slightly when she walked, how her hips seemed to sway like a pendulum, and how curvy her figure was. Yep, should never leave a teenager with a copy of Ika Ika. Of course, Naruto would blame his godfather if anyone asked him why he was perverted. Naruto pulled up a chair as he watched Shizune sit on his bed. He could tell she was having a look around. It was only normal after all. However, he wasn't expecting the surprised look she was giving him. What? Naruto asked curiously while raising an eyebrow. Oh, nothing. It's just I can't remember you bringing this much stuff, Shizune asked, scratching her head sheepishly. Naruto shrugged as he looked over to what she was talking about. He always unsealed some of his clothes and weapons when he was comfy enough to relax, but he could see how it could be confusing since he never had a bag or anything. I never carry a bag on me. It's understandable. I usually just carry everything in storage seals, Naruto said calmly. Wow, you must be really good at fuinjutsu then, Shizune said with a smile. Naruto narrowed his eyes slightly. He couldn't tell if she was trying to gather intel on him or whether she was being just friendly, and seeing how it was usually the former, he was not going to take any chances. I think you should get to your point, Shizune-san, Naruto said with a little edge on his voice. Oh, that's right, Tsunade-sama, Shizune started off sadly. She wasn't always like that. She just hasn't been able to get over the death of two of her loved ones, Shizune whispered. Naruto nodded slightly. My uncle Dan Kato was her lover, but he died during the Second Shinobi War that shook her up completely, and the death of her younger brother Naoki. Naruto's eyes widened slightly at the news. Tsunade had a younger brother that died. The thought had him reeling. To Minato. Would he have been like that if Minato died? No, he would have been worst. Ever since then she's been bitter towards Konoha and just life really, Shizune stated sadly. Naruto looked at her however and could tell she was biting her lips. And what about you? Naruto asked, surprising the black-haired women. What do you mean? Shizune asked, stuttering and slightly blushing at the serious gaze Naruto was giving her. You're a woman in her early 20s. Your uncle was Tsunade's lover, and by how protective Tsunade is of you I can tell you've been traveling with each other for a while. I'm also guessing your parents died when you were at a young age, leaving your uncle to look after you, and after his death that duty was left to Tsunade, so I'm guessing it can't be easy living that life, right? Naruto explained, leaving a gaping Shizune. You're right, it isn't easy. I know. I'm a constant reminder of my uncle to Tsunade-sama, being the one who has to look after Tsunade-sama when she gets too drunk, but it must be traveling alone, right, Naruto-kun? Shizune finally getting over the fact that Naruto was able to do a quick analysis of her life from what little information he had. Touché, Shizune-san, touché, you're a lot smarter than you act, aren't you? Naruto said with a smirk. I'm a medic. It's natural for me to understand how the mind works, and I can tell the moment I heard you talk. You're sad. You don't show it as you see it as a weakness, and I can tell from what Jiraiya-sama said it's about your brother, Shizune said quietly. You don't know anything about me, Naruto shot back harshly while glaring at Shizune. I know. I'm not judging. I don't know your circumstances, so I have no right to question you or your motives. I just want you to know that I trust you, Shizune said softly. Naruto stood up and walked towards the window and moved the curtain slightly so he could see outside. It was so quiet. How could she trust him? How could he trust her? They had only met a couple of hours ago. Perhaps it was her kind nature that made him feel at ease as traveling as he did. He rarely met genuine nice people. I sometimes think of going back, but I know how much danger there is in doing that, not just for Minato, but for Konoha as well. I can't afford to be selfish no matter how much I want to be. There are just too many lives at risk, Naruto explained while closing his eyes painfully tight. It's my burden and mine alone. When and if Minato finds out the truth, he can hate me, but as long as he is safe, that's fine. I'm trusting you not to tell anyone about this, Shizune-san. The consequences for everybody could be dire. Naruto finished opening his eyes with new resolve. However, Naruto was shocked when he felt two arms encircle themselves around his waist and a pair of crush against his back. You don't have to say anything, Naruto-kun, Shizune whispered next to his ear. Naruto sighed. He was glad that he could tell someone a little of what he was thinking. Acting quickly, Naruto turned his face quickly and planted his lips on Shizune. Naruto groaned tiredly as he slowly woke up from what he would call an excellent night. Looking to his right, he found the reason why he had such an excellent night. He smiled slightly at the sight of Shizune using his chest as a pillow. The black-haired woman had really done a number on him last night. He did at one point believe she was unsatisfiable since she had him at an orgasm one after the other. Now that itself was a new one for Naruto, as the only other women he had slept with were all civilians who never had the stamina to keep up with him, and being an Uzumaki, his stamina was far higher than most. Yes, it could be said that kunoichis had far more stamina than civilian women. Not that he was complaining though. Shizune took him by surprise last night, and he could honestly say that whoever ended up marrying Shizune would be lucky, especially if they were gifted with a life that he had experienced last night. A soft moan broke him out of his thoughts as he saw Shizune slowly waking up. She looked up at him and smiled before leaning in and giving him a quick kiss on the lips. Once she pulled back, she raked Naruto's chest lightly with her finger before sitting up, letting the cover fall off her, revealing her bare skin to Naruto. Are you going? Naruto asked, a little surprised by how early it was in the morning. Shizune stood up and turned around and gave Naruto a small smile. Yeah, it's probably for the best I get back to my room before Tsunade-sama comes to check up on me, Shizune answered while picking up her clothes. Yeah, she'd probably try killing me for what we did last night, Naruto said, sitting up. Tying the obi of her black kimono, Shizune nodded and looked towards the mirror in the room and began to straighten her hair out. Naruto awakened as well, decided to search for his clothes and proceeded to get dressed, hoping to get a couple of hours of training in. After they were both dressed, Shizune walked towards the door and turned around and leaned into Naruto, who was right behind her. Thank you for last night, Naruto-kun. I want you to know that you can trust me with anything, Shizune said, wrapping her arms around Naruto's neck and giving him a slow, heated kiss in which Naruto was more than happy to return. Pulling away, Naruto gave one last smile and nodded, while Shizune smiled sadly and walked out of the room, leaving Naruto alone to ponder. Well, that was different, Naruto mumbled to himself, strapping his katana around his waist and walking out of his room. On the way out of the hotel, Naruto could feel his eyebrow twitching as he remembered the old man behind the receptionist counter giving him a smirk that told him that the man knew what he did last night with Shizune, especially if his comment about being up all night meant anything. It took about 20 minutes for Naruto to find a decent training area that was secluded and far enough from the village that he could train and not be disturbed. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto said, putting his hand in a seal. Instantly 5 exact copies of Naruto appeared. Wordlessly, Naruto slowly unsheathed his katana and watched as the clones quickly unsheathed theirs and ran towards him. Ducking under the first slice, Naruto rolled backwards and lifted the sword above his head and blocked a downward strike from another clone. Quickly noticing a clone running towards him, Naruto waited until the clone was right next to him and moves his katana away, causing the clone he was defending against to fall forward with its attack and sliced a clone, making it explode in cloud of smoke. Grinning, Naruto stood up and looked around as the remaining 4 clones circled him. Running towards one of the clones, Naruto sliced at one but was quickly blocked and pushed back. Another clone ran behind Naruto and attempted to attack him from behind. However, using the momentum the clone gave him when it pushed him back, Naruto held the katana vertically downwards, covering his neck and stopping the clone from taking his head off his shoulders. Seeing the clone in front of him attempting to strike him down, Naruto kicked it in the stomach, sending it flying. Using the surprise the clones were showing at the offense, Naruto outpowered the clone behind him and pushed its katana back and quickly spun around and sliced the clone's stomach, making it explode in a cloud of smoke. Sweating slightly, Naruto noticed the two clones run over to the one he had kicked down and helped pick him up. Giving up, Naruto smirked, knowing the clones had the same personality as him, and no one knew how to annoy Naruto more than Naruto himself. "Huh, you wish you want us to give up because you're tired, idiot," one of the clones said while the other two started to laugh. Feeling his eyebrow twitch, Naruto cursed himself for trying gain an advantage by mocking his clones. Of course he should have remembered that the clones would know how to annoy him as well. "Bastards," Naruto growled in bad temperament, something he blamed his mother for since she was always someone who could be riled up easily. The three clones smirked before charging at Naruto in a triangular formation. Naruto took an intake of breath before closing his eyes and crouching slightly. Naruto swung his katana with one hand, blocking the clone at the front, parrying the blade. Seeing the two clones at the side ascending on him, Naruto held out his palm and formed a Rasengan and launched it into the clone's gut, making it explode. Noticing the two clones coming to attack him, Naruto ducked under one swing and quickly sidestepped and downward strike and took a hold of the clone's shoulder and sent it flying into the other, causing them to fall to the ground. Naruto smiled as he felt a small trail of blood run down his cheek from the clone that attacked with the downward strike. "Got you," Naruto said, disappearing in a yellow flash behind the clones and quickly swiping through both their torsos and made them explode in smoke. Naruto sighed as he wiped the blood of his cheek and then looked at the palm of his hand. "I'm getting better at using the Hiraishin no Jutsu now. It won't be long until I'll be strong enough to take down countries by myself," Naruto thought before quickly putting his hands together. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Elsewhere in a small darkened room, two figures could be found talking to one another. "Orochimaru-sama, is it wise we stay in this country? I've had reports that your old teammate Jiraiya is looking around these parts with a cloaked individual, and Tsunade is also in these areas," a man with gray hair and round-rimmed glasses said. "Ah, Kabuto, you shouldn't worry so much. Jiraiya is merely a pest. If I come across him, I'll crush him. Same with Tsunade. However, this cloaked individual you say, I've got a task for you. I want you to identify and engage him. Try find out what techniques he possess," Orochimaru said, smiling with an evil gleam in his eye. "Do you know who it is, Orochimaru-sama?" Kabuto asked, narrowing his eyes. "I have an idea. If the individual has blonde hair, I want you to inform him I know who he is and I know what he wants to protect," Orochimaru said as he walked out of the room while laughing. Naruto opened his eyes and looked at the clear blue sky above him. He had finished his training and was trying to decide whether he should go see both Tsunade and Shizune or just relax out here a little more, deciding that Tsunade would probably be mad if he never at least showed an appearance. He stood up and sighed before walking back towards the village. "So why are you in such a happy mood?" Tsunade asked her apprentice as they both sat down at a bar while Tsunade had a cup of sake in her hand and Shizune just sat there with Tauntaun in her hands. Shizune blushed at her master's question. It was true, she had been humming from the moment she had met up with Tsunade. She had even found herself smiling for no reason at all. "Ah, what do you mean, Tsunade-sama?" Shizune asked nervously, hoping to try fight down the blush she had. However, Tsunade never answered. She only narrowed her eyes at Shizune. She had an idea why the woman was so happy, but she couldn't understand why she would have. The last time she was like this was a little over 2 years ago, and also, who? "It doesn't matter anyway. Have you seen the brat?" Tsunade said while sipping on her sake. "Brat? And here I was coming to visit both of you." Both Tsunade and Shizune looked towards where the voice came from and saw Naruto walking into the bar. "Well, no one asked you to. Has that perverted sensei of yours got in contact with you yet?" Tsunade asked, looking at him seriously. "No," Naruto answered. He also found it a little strange that his sensei hadn't contacted him yet, but he did say he would be gone for a couple of days, so he didn't really care. "Ah, fine. So Naruto, any plans for your birthday?" Tsunade asked with an evil glint. Naruto gulped, knowing that if he answered anything that was remotely perverted she wouldn't have a problem beating him. No, not yet, Naruto answered, scratching his head. He looked towards Shizune and found her blushing, and once she noticed his gaze she immediately looked down. Ha! You'll probably do something perverted, Tsunade said loudly and crossing her arms over her chest. Naruto frowned slightly. Granted, he may be a bit of a pervert, but what guy wasn't, and he had even seen sometimes women that were more perverted than him. Who knows, but speaking of my birthday, do you think you could teach me something, for medical use? Naruto asked, looking towards Tsunade. Isn't training from one Sannin enough? Tsunade asked. Well, Jiraiya-sensei has taught me how to defend myself, but when it comes to healing myself or others I don't know anything, Naruto said. Fine, think of it as an early birthday present. Come on, let's go, this place is starting to annoy me anyway, Tsunade said, standing up and walked towards the door. Is she sober enough to train? Naruto leaned in, whispering to Shizune, hoping that Tsunade wouldn't hear. Surprisingly, she sometimes performs better when drunk, Shizune stated bluntly, and stood up and followed Tsunade closely, followed by Naruto. Outside, Tsunade had found a small opening at the edge of the village where it was quiet. In front of her she had Naruto staring at her intently while Shizune was at the sidelines watching. So, what to teach you? Tsunade said while tapping her chin with her finger. Naruto could feel his eye twitching. Oh, so I'm going to teach you the mystical palm technique, Tsunade said, pulling out a scroll, and inside was a fish flopping around. Why, is there a fish in there? Naruto asked, pointing towards the fish. That is your test subject. Here, I want you to try this, Tsunade said, placing her hands over the fish, and immediately her hands started to glow green. Naruto watched in amazement as the fish amazingly started flopping around, even more lively than it previously was. Now I want you to do exactly the same as I just did. All you do is travel chakra to your hands and send it to the fish. I don't expect you to get it first time, so I'm going to leave you here and come find me once you've finished at the hotel, Tsunade said, walking off back into the village. Naruto glanced at the retreating form of Tsunade and sighed. He could see how sad she was. Even if she was trying to hide it, he could see that Tsunade was hurt, and he couldn't blame her. He could understand her to some point. After the death of his parents, he saw Shizune send him a small smile before following Tsunade. Well, I might as well get started, Naruto said, placing his hands over the fish, and smiled when he saw them glow green. It was no way near as good as Tsunade's, but he was surprised that he could actually do it on his first attempt. Perhaps those chakra control lessons Jiraiya had constantly drilled into him were useful after all. A few hours later. Yesss, Naruto shouted in triumphant as he watched the fish bounce lively on the scroll. He had been practicing, hoping he could get the fish to stay alive. He had always been told he had good chakra control. Just as he was about to get up and find Tsunade, he picked up the sounds of someone moving in the trees. Narrowing his eyes and quickly putting his hood up on his cloak, Naruto turned towards where the noise was coming from. For several seconds there was no noise in the area, and as Naruto scanned the trees he quickly caught sight of a figure perched on a branch. Quickly reaching into his kunai holster, Naruto threw a kunai towards the figure. His eyes widened slightly when he heard the sound of steel hitting flesh and the figure fall out of the tree. Quickly dashing towards the figure, Naruto kept one hand on the handle of his katana and waited for any sign of movements. After several seconds of no movement, Naruto moved towards the figure and widened his eyes when he saw a black-haired person laying on the ground. Naruto ran to the person and turned him around. He found his kunai in the chest of the man. Pulling it out, Naruto narrowed his eyes at the body. This person hasn't just died. His skin color and temperature proves that, but why would someone leave a dead body in the tree unless? Naruto's thoughts were cut short at the sound of someone moving behind him. Thinking quickly, Naruto ducked a kunai that would have sliced his throat. However, it did rip the hood where parts of Naruto's blonde hair was sticking out. Grabbing hold of the attacker's arm, Naruto pulled him forward and kicked him into a tree, sending him sprawling at the bottom of the tree. Quickly composing himself into a standing position, Naruto narrowed his eyes at his attacker. Whoever this was, they were more than your average bandit. Who are you? Naruto asked emotionlessly, watching the person stand up. The person was panting and holding his ribs, and instead of answering charged at Naruto once more. Naruto watched the unknown attacker charge again and without blinking bent his knees waiting for his attacker. However, Naruto's eyes did widen slightly when he saw the attacker's hands start to glow green, quickly deciding to move out of the way of one strike. Naruto grabbed the attacker's wrist and bent it behind his back and shoved his face into the ground. "I'll ask you again, who are you?" Naruto asked while placing his katana towards the incapacitated attacker's throat. Naruto narrowed his eyes when he heard no answer. Deciding to find out on his own, he pulled the hood down and was surprised when he saw a man who had gray hair and circle-rimmed glasses. His face was slightly bruised from the impact of the floor. "Who sent you?" Naruto asked, narrowing his eyes from under his cloak as he dug his katana a little into the man's throat. "Ah, it was Orochimaru-sama," the man said in shaky voice. Naruto scowled when he heard the snake Sanin's name. "Who are you and what do you want?" Naruto asked harshly, staring at the back of Kabuto's head. "My name is Kabuto," Kabuto said while silently cursing at the fact he had been captured. He was fairly confident in his abilities as being trained under the snake Sanin himself, who wouldn't. However, it was more disturbing how easily he was taken down, especially with such precise movements to stop any forms of attacks, and he also cursed himself for not being able to completely reveal his capturer. However, he was able to confirm that he did in fact have blonde hair if he could only somehow relay this information to his master. "I see. So tell me why I shouldn't just end your pathetic little life?" Naruto asked, sending out a little killing intent. Kabuto started to panic after hearing Naruto's statement. This was something Orochimaru had not foretold him. How would he get out of this? "I know who he is and who he wants to protect." Kabuto's eyes widened slightly as he remembered his master's words. Was this a test for him also? Was Orochimaru testing his ability under pressure? "It would be unwise to kill me. I am scheduled to meet Orochimaru-sama, and if I am, let's say, incapacitated, I was told to leave you a message by Orochimaru-sama himself. He knows who you are and who you are protecting," Kabuto said with a small smirk. Naruto's eyes widened at Kabuto's words. No, this couldn't be possible. He was supposed to be known as dead. How could that snake find out, and better yet, how did he find out about his connection with Minato? "Get out of here," Naruto commanded, standing up and gritting his teeth. Kabuto slowly stood up and smiled at Naruto's posture. He had him and he knew it. All he needed to do was see his face. "Show me your face and I'll ask Orochimaru-sama to save this person you are protecting." As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he suddenly felt a pressure that he had never felt before. Not even Orochimaru was able of such killing intent. He could feel his legs shaking and beads of sweats dripping down his face. "I won't tell you again," Naruto said, turning his back on Kabuto and tightening his knuckles. Kabuto, being intimidated by the killing intent Naruto was sending, slightly nodded and jumped into the trees and ran away. Back with Naruto, he was shaking with rage, a rage he had not felt since he had thought of that masked shinobi that ruined his life. All that effort he put into protecting Minato, and out of nowhere some loser and Orochimaru was threatening him by threatening his brother. Not realizing a couple of hours had passed since his meeting with Kabuto, Naruto still found himself not moving from the exact same position when Kabuto had left. His hair was now shadowing his eyes, his fists were shaking and clenched so tightly that they had turned white. Quickly lifting his head up, revealing his cool azure eyes, Naruto snarled. "Threatening me, Orochimaru? Kabuto, I'm going to make you regret that," Naruto said, disappearing in a yellow flash. Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze was ultimately pissed and was going to show the world if he had to what would happen if anyone threatened his family. The sounds of heavy breathing and panting could be heard in a forest of Kumogakure. The source of the heavy breathing was none other than Orochimaru's right-hand man Kabuto. The gray-haired man was running through the trees as fast as he could in hopes of reaching his master. "I need to inform Orochimaru-sama of that person. His killing intent is larger than anyone's have ever felt. Even Orochimaru-sama." Kabuto thought. He smiled slightly at the sight of Orochimaru's secret base opening. All he had to do was make it there and he'd be safe. Sighing happily as he dropped down in front of the opening, Kabuto walked into a small cave and found himself meeting a circular metal door. Pushing the right code into the pad next to the door, he smiled when he saw the door open. Quickly walking in, Kabuto paced off towards Orochimaru's room. Once reaching there, Kabuto knocked on the door and slowly walked in and bowed towards the shadowed figure in the room. Orochimaru-sama, I'm back and I'm happy to inform you that the shinobi following Jiraiya was who you expected it to be, as I was able to confirm he had blonde hair, Kabuto informed. I see. Were you able to confirm any facial description or any of his techniques? Orochimaru asked seriously. However, all Kabuto could do was look down in shame. No, I was not. I was easily overpowered and even spared, Kabuto said shamefully. That does not matter. I was expecting such results in fact. However, I think we may have to evacuate this base, Orochimaru frowned. But why, Orochimaru-sama? He is merely one person, Kabuto asked in confusion. However, Orochimaru frowned once again. That one person is enough. Go to the laboratory and clear the important things out. We've been here far too long anyway. I'm putting my creation into motion. Soon we will have a village to hide behind, Orochimaru said grinning. Kabuto frowned and nodded and walked out of the room. Soon he was walking down the quiet corridors and the staircases. Reaching the bottom of the base, he came across another heavy thick steel door. Punching in the code again, he smiled when he saw the door open. However, before he could step foot in the room, the sound of metal piercing skin could be heard. Blood hit the ceiling and Kabuto could feel nothing but pain shooting from his back. Behind him was none other than Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze with his katana raised in the air, the tip of the blade covered in blood. Naruto quickly kicked Kabuto to the ground and smashing his face off the floor. Stepping over him, Naruto was surprised a little when he felt something grab his ankle. Looking down, Naruto looked at Kabuto, who looked about ready to keel over at any moment. Why? How? Kabuto asked, struggling to keep hold while blood poured out of his back. You should never ever threaten me, and for how? Look at your wrist, Naruto said emotionlessly while kicking Kabuto's hand away. Kabuto looked towards his wrist and his eyes widened. There was a seal. This was the Hiraishin no Jutsu seal. How did this person know that move? However, before he could ask, Naruto kicked him in the face, breaking his nose and jaw and sent him flying and crashing into a wall in a bloody mess. Cuckoo! Naruto turned his head slightly and narrowed his eyes at the sound. Stepping past the metal door, Naruto began to walk towards the noise. However, he was not expecting the metal door to close and slam shut. Seeing as the only way to go was forward, Naruto proceeded to walk. On his way through the corridor, he noticed that this must have been the laboratory. As to his sides, he noticed cages with people in them, and the further he got, the worse it got, it seemed. Soon he could hear screaming coming from the cages. Walking towards one of the cages, Naruto scowled slightly at the sight of the person inside. Their flesh was rotting, their bones were clearly shown. They were, even by the looks of things, eaten their own skin. However, what he did notice on all of them was the mark on their necks, almost like branded cattle's. Stopping at a wooden door, Naruto slowly opened it and heard the laughing become louder. Looking towards the far corner of the room, he noticed what seemed to be a hospital bed with a curtain covering it. Cuckoo! That's right, come closer, the creepy voice of Orochimaru said from behind the curtain. Naruto narrowed his eyes and quickly ripped off the curtain and revealed a small TV with Orochimaru on it. It seems the little rat fell into my trap, Orochimaru said, licking his lips. I'm not the rat, and it will do you no good trying to be hunter in this game, as you are my prey, Naruto said. Oh, big words, Naruto-kun, your parents would be proud, Orochimaru said, smiling. Naruto pulled down his hood, revealing his face, as he saw no point in hiding from Orochimaru. Ah, that's better, Naruto-kun, you look so much like your father. It will make killing you that much better, Orochimaru smiled. How do you know about me and Minato? Naruto asked. Oh, I knew since the beginning. Do not underestimate me, Naruto-kun, but you can rest assured I won't be hurting Minato-kun. I'd have more than you after me if I did, Orochimaru glared. What are you talking about? Naruto asked. Oh, you don't know yet, do you? I suggest you go to Kurigakure to find out more. Also, one more thing, Naruto-kun, try not to die, Orochimaru said laughing as the TV turned off. Bastard! Naruto growled, walking away from the TV and looking around the room. He quickly noticed a desk in the far end of the room with a jar on it and by the looks of things notes. As he reached the desk, his eyes widened when he saw a pair of Sharingan eyes floating in the jar. Looking at the notes, Naruto couldn't believe what he was seeing. January 1st. The test was a failure. I was unable to fully use the power of the Mangekyo Sharingan as it drained too much chakra from me. Also, I was unable to use any of the Mangekyo techniques. It seems I will need the body of an Uchiha to use these eyes to their full potential. Naruto scanned over the document. It was the last entry that was put in this logbook and it was quite a while ago. Quickly pulling out a seal, Naruto stored the Sharingan eyes away so Orochimaru couldn't have his precious eyes. Looking around, Naruto also found medicines of all types. Picking up a blue bottle, Naruto read the side. Microscopic polyangiitis medicine. Why would Orochimaru have these? Naruto murmured to himself. Naruto's head snapped towards the door as he heard the sound of metal hitting the floor. Walking towards the door cautiously, Naruto proceeded to open it slowly. However, what he saw caused him to narrow his eyes in disgust. Men, women and even children were lined up in the corridor staring at him emotionlessly. He also noticed that a lot of them were the people trapped in those cages. Move! Naruto commanded. However, when they didn't move, he slightly unsheathed his katana, though he did almost put it away when a small boy came out from the crowd and walked towards him. However, what happened next caused Naruto's eyes to widen a fraction. The seal around the boy's neck expanded, his skin turned a darker tone, giant claws grew out from where the boy's hands were, and his eyes turned a horrible shade of red. Kill! The boy said quietly, launching himself towards Naruto. Naruto dodged the boy easily, though he was surprised by the speed shown by the boy. But what struck Naruto worst was the lifeless look the boy had in his eyes, and by the looks of things the boy was near 10 years old. The same as Minato. It was then the boy's appearance left and in its place blonde hair grew out from the original brown. The red eyes slowly turned into blue and 3 whisker marks grew on each cheek. Hesitating slightly, Naruto was unable to stop the blow that hit him in the shoulder, knocking him back. Shit! Naruto groaned, shaking his head. However, Nimato's appearance never left. Steeling himself, Naruto's eyes turned a motionless blue and pulled out his sword. I'm sorry, Naruto mumbled, disappearing in a blink of an eye, and was immediately right next to the boy, slashing the boy's torso. Naruto stared unaffected as the boy's body split in half, showering the room in blood. Who's next? Naruto said quietly, turning around and staring at the group in front of him. Without flinching, Naruto watched as the rest slowly transformed into monsters as well. Naruto pulled out 3-bladed kunai that only the Yondaime was ever seen using and launched it through them all so it was lodged into the wall. Disappearing in a yellow flash, Naruto was next to the kunai with his sword raised high in the air, but behind him the cursed seal fighters did not move. Slowly their limbs began to slide off their body and fall to the floor, showering the room in even more blood. Turning around, Naruto saw the corridor filled with corpses. The walls and even the ceiling was covered in blood. Pulling the kunai out of the wall, Naruto formed a Rasengan with one hand and hit it against the steel door, and after a couple seconds the door started to buckle, then finally flew off its hinges. Naruto scowled slightly when he saw Kabuto missing from the spot he had been left in. However, he wasn't sure how Kabuto would be able to move unless he had some unique healing ability. He was grateful, however, for the blood trail. Following the blood trail, Naruto was glad that Kabuto must have been too severely injured to care that he was leaving a blood trail, but Naruto did notice that the blood was getting less and less. He smiled slightly at the sight of a heavy metal door. Forming another Rasengan, Naruto smashed it into the door, and just like the laboratory door, the door buckled and flew off its hinges. Naruto sighed as he noticed the darkened sky. He hadn't even realized how long he had been down there. Tsunade was probably going to kill him for wandering off or something that would involve a lot of physical pain. As soon as Naruto took his first step, the sound of rubble falling caught his attention. Looking upwards, Naruto's eyes widened at the sight of a giant claw coming at him. Quickly dodging out of the way by rolling, Naruto stood up and looked at the damage caused, as where he was stood was now a giant hole with dust coming out. Pulling out his katana, Naruto took his stance and waited for the dust to clear to see who his attacker was. However, when the dust settled, Naruto's eyebrows rose when he saw the sight of an 8 feet man with black hair and a muscled torso, but what caught Naruto's attention was the mark around his neck, as there was several cursed seals around it. His skin was blue and on his back were 2 giant wings. Quick! You should have just stayed still so I could crush you, the man said, laughing evilly. So you are conscious of your actions, Naruto said quietly while staring as the large man stood up and turned to face Naruto with an evil grin. Well, of course, what Orochimaru-sama wants, Orochimaru-sama gets, the man said, taking off towards Naruto and launched a punch aiming to hit Naruto in the face. However, Naruto sidestepped the attack and sliced his katana upwards and took off the guy's arm and jumped backwards, avoiding being hit by the other arm. Naruto looked at the man in confusion. However, when he heard the man giggling, he quickly narrowed his eyes when the man burst out into laughter while what was left of his arm sprayed out blood. Haha, my blood, I haven't seen that in a while. Tell me, boy, do you have any family? The man asked with an evil glint in his eyes. I don't see how that's any of your concern, Naruto said coldly with narrowed eyes and gritted his teeth when he saw the man start laughing. Judging by that reaction, I'd guess you do, and I'm going to tell you now. I'll find them and I'll tear them limb from limb in front of you, the man said, causing Naruto's eyes to turn into ice. Well, I guess I'll have to tear you apart, Naruto said, rushing towards the man in a burst of speed and slicing off one of the wings on the man's back. The man howled in pain before trying to hit Naruto with his other wing. Naruto quickly dodged and pierced the wing with his sword and sliced downwards, leaving the wing barely hanging on. As Naruto was about to swing for the man's head, he jumped back, noticing the seals around his neck starting glow strangely. A purple aura surrounded the man and Naruto could feel the power coming out. His eyes widened when he saw the man's appearance changing. The wing on his back slowly disappeared, his arm grew back, his hair grew longer, and on top of his head 2 giant horns grew. Bastard! I'll make you pay, the man shouted, charging at Naruto head first, intending to impale Naruto with the horns. Quickly jumping over him, Naruto landed in a crouched position. He was surprised, however, when he saw the man lunging at him again. The seal not only regenerated parts of his body but even made him faster. Sidestepping and ducking under the punches the cursed seal user sent, Naruto quickly retaliated and sent a punch to the man's chest and winced when he felt like he had just punched steel. Backflipping away from a swipe that was intending to take his head off his shoulders, Naruto took a moment to get some distance from the man. Idiot! I'm not just any cursed seal fighter. You see, my cursed seal is a little different. My body now is made out of rock, meaning any of my hits on you will be fatal, the man laughed while Naruto narrowed his eyes. His defense has dramatically improved as well. Orochimaru, you snake, what are you planning? Naruto thought, sheathing his katana. Why are you putting your sword away? Do you finally see how futile it is to fight me? The man laughed crazily. However, Naruto never answered him and went through hand seals. Raiden. Jaibashi. 1. Naruto placed his arms forward and immediately giant sparks of electricity came out and flew towards the man. I told you my skin is made of earth, there's nothing you can do that will hurt me, the man said as he watched the current of electricity come towards him. However, when they made contact, his skin started sizzle. What? The man shouted, screaming in pain as electricity ran through his body, forcing him to his knees. You were nothing more than a pawn, a weakling blessed with powers that an idiot would not be able to use. You were merely a distraction, Naruto said, walking towards him and unsheathing his sword. Get away from me, the man shouted in fear but was unable to move due to the electricity. Normally I would spare weaklings like you, but you said something that I wasn't able to let go, and for that you'll die, Naruto said, moving in a burst of speed behind the man and without any hesitation stabbed the man in the back, forcing him to the ground. Please spare me, the man asked in fear as he coughed out blood from the sword that was lodged into his back. Sorry, no second chances, especially to those who threaten my family, Naruto stated, forming a Rasengan and launched it into the man's head, crushing his skull. Naruto sighed as he pulled the sword from out of the man's back and looked at the sky and into the full moon. We're looking at the same moon, aren't we? but it's still too far, right Minato? Naruto said to himself as he sheathed his katana back into its holder. And where have you been all day? Tsunade shouted as they were in the hotel room. Naruto panicked a little as he saw Tsunade's eyes on fire. He looked towards Shizune for help but was surprised when he saw her gaze at him worryingly. Sighing, Naruto could see their point of view. He did in fact meet up with both of them with blood covered all over his face and clothes. Actually thinking about it, he was glad that no one saw him. I was caught up in something, all right. There's nothing to worry about. I'm not a child. I knew what I was doing, Naruto said, trying to reason with the two worried women. That's not the point, Naruto, and you know it. Could you imagine what would have happened if Jiraiya came back and I had to tell him that another apprentice of his may be dead? Tsunade shouted again, while Naruto looked down in shame. He was put in a situation where he couldn't do anything else. Either he told Tsunade about Orochimaru and break his sensei's trust, or not tell Tsunade and get a scolding. However, thinking about it, he did wonder why Tsunade cared so much, since she hadn't really viewed him as anyone she cared for. I know, I'm so used to being on my own that I don't really think about things like telling someone where I went. Usually if I want to go I just do. I'm sorry for worrying you, Naruto said apologetically and sending a glance to Shizune, who smiled. I wasn't worried, brat. I just wanted to keep my money, that's all. Tsunade stuttered out over the fact Naruto had called her out. True, she was worried about Jiraiya asking back for the money he had given her to look after Naruto, but she was also worried. But Naruto was part Uzumaki, the same as her, and she had come to sort of like Naruto through his witty comebacks and personality, as she found it amusing when the Kushina part of Naruto would come out. However, it was also the fact she could see it in his eyes, the pain of loss, the exact same eyes she had, and she did feel bad for him having to lose his parents and the chance to see his brother all in one night. However, she could blame that on the village. It had a fond way of taking things people cared about. Ha, yeah, right. You're acting like a worried mother. Naruto smirked. Shizune gasped at Naruto's words while Tsunade's eyebrows twitched and her eyes closed in frustration. What was that? Tsunade asked, a dark aura surrounding her. Both Naruto and Shizune both visibly gulped at the killing intent. Nothing. Naruto cursed himself for stuttering, especially when he saw Tsunade glare at him. That's right, nothing. Now go get cleaned up before you come out with us, Tsunade ordered, pointing towards the bathroom of his room. Naruto stared at her for a few seconds with his mouth wide open before grumbling and walking towards the bathroom. Shouldn't we leave him be, Tsunade-sama? It's clear Naruto-kun must be tired, Shizune said to her master as they heard the sound of the shower going. No, the brat's already wandered off once today. He's being suspiciously sneaky. I'm keeping my eye on him, Tsunade said as she watched Shizune lay down on Naruto's bed with raised eyebrows. I'm sure Naruto-kun has his reasons, Tsunade-sama, Shizune said as she lay on Naruto's bed, and immediately the night she shared with Naruto flashed through her mind. All the touching, kissing and the pleasuring. As the last thought ran through her mind, she sat up and blushed heavily. It was true she didn't love Naruto, but she did care for him. Yeah, well, he better, Tsunade grumbled to herself. About 10 minutes later, Naruto appeared, walking out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist. However, he was not expecting both Tsunade and Shizune to still be in his room. What are you still doing here? Never heard of privacy, Naruto said while blushing. Huh, it's not like you've got anything I haven't seen. I'm a doctor, you know, Tsunade said, smirking as she checked over Naruto, and if she were to be honest, she was impressed. He had the body of a young man. His six-pack was definitively defined for his age, and his muscles were also defined, and with him stepping out of the shower she had a hard time not blushing slightly. Naruto awkwardly went into his drawers and pulled out some clothes. At least now he could say this was the most awkward moment of his life, with two women staring at him with only a towel to cover his nudity. Well, with Shizune it wasn't as bad since she had already seen all of him. After getting dressed, the trio walked out of the hotel and went to the bar. It was quiet, Naruto noticed, as most people were decorating for some type of festival that was happening tomorrow. I wonder where Jiraiya-sensei is. He was looking for Orochimaru. How did he not notice the base that Orochimaru was hiding in? I'll have to ask him. but I also need to find out what that snake meant. Who else has their eyes set on Minato? I wish sensei would come back soon, Naruto thought, sipping his sake. You okay, brat? Tsunade asked, snapping her fingers in front of his face, getting his attention. He smiled slightly and nodded. Yes, for now, Naruto said, hoping that he'd be able to enjoy his birthday tomorrow.